The Young and the Restless spoilers. In the ever-shifting landscape of Genoa City, new storms often rise from old shadows, and familiar streets can suddenly feel foreign when a new presence starts to bend the air around it. That is exactly what happened when Matt arrived, bringing with him a strange mixture of fear, anticipation, and a kind of restless curiosity that few newcomers ever managed to evoke. Most of Genoa City knew only the surface. Rumors, fleeting impressions, the sense that something about Matt was unsettling in ways no one could quite articulate. He carried himself like a man who had lived too many lives, someone whose silence held more danger than any spoken threat. For many residents, his presence felt like a warning that the calm they had fought so hard to build might soon be shattered. But for some others, myself included, his arrival felt like the beginning of a new chapter the show desperately needed. His quiet intensity, his unpredictable calmness, the way a single look from him could make an entire room shift, it all promised a kind of story we had not seen in years. Matt wasn't just a villain, or a hero, or a broken soul. He was a disruption, one that could pull Genoa City out of its comfort zone and force everyone to confront truths they had been avoiding for far too long. What nobody expected, however, was the rumor that followed close behind him, whispered first in online forums, then in fan circles, and finally in the speculative corners of the press. Jill Abbott might be connected to Matt in a way that could rewrite decades of emotional history. The idea seemed absurd at first, almost too explosive to be real. But the more people looked at the pattern, the more it began to make a frightening kind of sense. According to the rumor, Jill, sharp-tongued, fiercely protective, forever wrestling with her own regrets, would return to Genoa City and come face-to-face with Matt. And in that moment, without warning, some small detail would cause her entire world to tilt. Something about him, an expression, a childhood scar, the shape of his jawline, or even a gesture he had no idea he was making, would strike her with the force of a memory she thought she had buried decades ago. She would know, instantly and with terrible clarity, that the stranger everyone feared might actually be her own son. If that were true, everything suddenly snapped into place with painful precision. Jill's long, complicated history with motherhood had always been one of the deepest emotional fractures in her life. Fans often debated why her relationship with Billy was so strained, why her affection for him always seemed forced or inconsistent, why her attempts to support him often felt like obligations rather than instinct. Over the years, viewers accepted it as part of Jill's flaws, her emotional walls, her regrets, her difficulty with vulnerability. But the rumor recontextualized everything. If Billy was not her biological child, if she had spent decades trying to love him the way a mother loves a son but always feeling something missing, something unspoken and inexplicable, then it all suddenly made sense. Her distance. Her frustration. Her inability to fully see Billy for who he was. Her harshness disguised as tough love. It was not cruelty, it was the silent grief of a woman who sensed, deep down, that something about her motherhood story had never been whole. And that made Billy's journey all the more heartbreaking. Billy, who had spent his entire life stumbling between triumph and failure, between self-destruction and redemption, had always carried a wounded longing inside him. No matter how successful he became, no matter how many people loved him or forgave him, the one thing he could never secure was Jill's unconditional acceptance. He tried so hard, countless times, to prove that he was worthy of her pride. He tried to be the son she wanted, to fill the space she seemed to keep empty even when he stood right in front of her. If Jill had suspected the truth for years without admitting it to herself, then Billy's endless efforts were not just emotional, they were tragic. He had been fighting for a place in a heart that was never fully open to him, not because Jill didn't care, but because some maternal instinct had been pointing elsewhere all along. Which brings us back to Matt. If Jill recognized him, even subconsciously, the emotional fallout would be catastrophic for everyone involved. She would suddenly have to face the possibility that the child she lost, the secret she locked away, or the mistake she made decades ago, had returned in the form of a man haunted by his own darkness. Matt, who had entered Genoa City like a storm front, would find himself caught in a collision between the life he lived and the life he never imagined he had. Would he feel it too? That strange pull, that instinctive familiarity? Or would he reject it, seeing Jill only as another obstacle, another threat, another person who wanted to define him? The tragedy is that Matt, for all his sharp edges and unpredictability, might have been waiting his entire life for exactly what Jill had withheld from Billy, a sense of belonging. But belonging is complicated when it comes wrapped in decades of lies, regrets, and emotional landmines. Jill would be terrified of losing Billy, of facing her own past, of admitting the truth she tried so hard to bury. And Matt would be torn between anger, confusion, hope, and fear. The revelation could push him toward redemption, or drive him deeper into the darkness that people already associate with him. But the biggest question of all, the one that hangs over this entire rumor like a blade, is terrifying in its simplicity. Does Matt realize Jill might be his mother? The answer is not simple. Matt is perceptive, almost unnervingly so. He reads people with an instinct that borders on predatory. If Jill reacted emotionally, even subtly, he would notice. He would file it away, analyze it, test it. But recognizing someone as your mother is not the same as sensing fear or curiosity. For Matt, the discovery would require something deeper, a crack in his armor, a moment where he lets himself wonder whether he was meant for more than isolation and conflict. And that vulnerability, for a man like him, is dangerous. If Matt does realize it, or even suspects it, the consequences would ripple across Genoa City. Billy would spiral, feeling betrayed yet again by forces he can't control. Jill would be forced to choose between the son she raised and the son she lost. And Matt, caught between rage and longing, could either tear the city apart or reshape it forever. In the end, whether the rumor is true or not, the mere possibility is enough to electrify the entire narrative. Because if Matt is Jill's son, then he wasn't just a new threat in Genoa City. He was a missing piece of a story that has been fractured for decades, a piece that, once found, could either heal old wounds or rip them open wider than ever before. In the dim emotional corridors of Genoa City, few stories are as fragile, painful, or deeply human as the one unfolding now. One that threatens to shatter long-held identities, rewrite decades of family history, and crack open wounds that have been quietly bleeding beneath the surface for years. At the heart of it all stands Billy, a man who has spent his entire life stumbling through the shadows cast by his own mistakes and the emotional distance of the woman he calls his mother. And the cruel irony is that just as he begins to steady himself, fate threatens to rip away the one identity he relied on for stability. The belief that he is Jill's biological son. If the rumor is true, if Jill's instincts are right, if the faint flicker of recognition she felt when looking at Matt is more than just a passing coincidence, then Billy's entire life becomes a question mark. A lifetime of emotional ache suddenly gains context, but context does not heal, it only explains. Billy has always longed for a love from Jill that felt whole, natural, and unconditional. He tried so hard to earn it, to prove himself, to be the son she could be proud of. And yet, deep down, some part of him always felt the distance, the hesitations, the way her affection sometimes seemed like a duty rather than a reflex. If he were to discover that he is not her biological son, the impact would be devastating. Every insecurity he ever carried would suddenly calcify into truth. He would look at his entire life through a cruel new lens. Was she disappointed in me because she somehow knew? Was I never enough because I was never hers in the first place? The emotional damage would be immeasurable. Billy wouldn't just lose a mother, he would lose the illusion that he ever belonged in that family at all. It would feel like the ground had disappeared beneath him, leaving him to fall with nothing to hold on to. While others might try to reassure him, to insist that family is more than blood, Billy's heart has always been fragile in ways he doesn't like to admit. The revelation could send him spiraling into the old patterns he fought so hard to leave behind, self-doubt, self-destruction, or the reckless search for comfort in all the wrong places. Because for Billy, this isn't just about biology. It's about identity, worthiness, and the question that has haunted him his entire life: am I truly loved? Meanwhile, Matt finds himself standing on the other end of a revelation he never asked for, never expected, and may not even want. For a man who built his world on independence, distrust, and emotional armor, the sudden possibility of having a biological mother, and that mother being Jill Abbott, could crack open something inside him he had never allowed himself to feel. Jill is not an easy woman, nor is she a simple one. She loves fiercely but selectively. She battles for the people who share her blood, but she struggles to express tenderness without turning it into control. If Matt truly is her son, the shift in her behavior would be immediate, instinctive, and overwhelming. A lifetime of guilt over the child she lost, whether by mistake, circumstance, or secrecy, would surge back with violent force. Her attempts to bond with him could become intense, suffocating, or erratic. She might begin to spoil him, defend him, elevate him in ways she never could for Billy. And for a man like Matt, who has always moved through life like a lone wolf, that sudden affection could feel like both a blessing and a trap. Acceptance could soften him, tempt him toward redemption; rejection or hesitation could push him into deeper darkness. And the cruel truth is that Jill, in her desperation to make up for lost time, might unintentionally wound both sons. By elevating Matt, she could emotionally destroy Billy. By hesitating with Matt, she could push him away before he ever gives her a chance. The emotional battlefield between the two men would be brutal. Billy, already fragile, would feel replaced, erased, unwanted. Matt, confused and defensive, would not understand why his existence automatically makes him the villain in Billy's story. And Jill, caught between longing for her newly discovered son and guilt for the one she may have never truly embraced, would become the unwilling architect of a fracture that might never heal. But beneath all of this emotional upheaval lies the single, silent question that could either validate or obliterate everything: is Jill right? Is Matt really her biological son? Instinct is powerful, but instinct is not truth. Recognition can be born from resemblance, trauma, guilt, or even imagination. Jill may have seen something familiar in Matt, but familiarity is not confirmation. And for a story this life-altering, this poisonous, this fragile, only one thing matters: the DNA test. Until the results arrive, everyone is suspended in a psychological limbo, forced to imagine futures that may never come to pass. Billy clings to the hope that he is still who he always believed he was, terrified of losing even the wounded version of family he has known. Matt wrestles with the strange, uncomfortable sensation that he might have roots in a city he came to disrupt. Jill struggles with memory fragments, emotional echoes, and the quiet fear that her entire life has been built on a lie she didn't know she was living. The DNA test will not just decide biology, it will decide identity, loyalty, family structure, emotional allegiance, and the entire trajectory of 3 intertwined lives. It is a test that has the potential to heal, but more likely, to destroy. And that is the unbearable beauty of this storyline: everyone is waiting, holding their breath, fearing the truth as much as they need it. Billy stands to lose everything. Matt stands to gain everything, or nothing. Jill's future as a mother hangs in the balance of a lab result. And until that result arrives, Genoa City remains a place where every glance, every conversation, every silence carries the weight of a secret that could rewrite their world forever. When the DNA results finally arrived, they did not crash into Genoa City with the dramatic thunder people might have imagined. Instead, they descended like a quiet winter storm, slow, cold, and suffocating. Sometimes the most devastating truths are not the ones shouted across a room but the ones whispered in a silence so heavy it presses against every rib. Jill was the first to read the results, her fingers trembling as she unfolded the stark white paper that, in a few clinical lines, held the power to rewrite decades of her life. All the fear, the guilt, the instinctive maternal pull she felt toward Matt, every unanswered question, every uneasy glance toward Billy, crystallized in that moment. Matt was indeed her biological son. The blood she thought she had lost all those years ago, the child she had buried in grief and confusion without ever truly understanding what happened, had returned to her in the form of a man she barely knew but instantly recognized. The confirmation should have brought closure, but it did not. Instead, it detonated a chain of emotional explosions that none of them were prepared to face. Billy felt the truth before anyone spoke it. He saw it in Jill's eyes. A mixture of awe, terror, and a kind of fierce, instinctive love he had never seen directed at him. He saw it in the way her breath caught, in the way she suddenly reached for Matt as if some invisible thread had yanked her forward. It wasn't spoken aloud yet, but Billy already knew. And that knowledge carved through him like a blade. Billy had always carried an ache inside him, an ache he never fully understood, an ache that now sharpened into clarity. Every time Jill hesitated before comforting him, every moment she withheld affection without explanation, every time she seemed disappointed, distracted, or detached, it suddenly made sense. It wasn't her being cold. It wasn't him failing to measure up. It was biology calling to biology, even when it didn't yet know its own truth. As Jill whispered Matt's name with a shaky voice, Billy felt something inside him collapse, quietly, completely, irreversibly. He was not just losing a mother. He was losing the illusion that he had ever truly belonged. Matt, on the other hand, stood frozen. For a man known for his confidence, his sharpness, his ability to destabilize a room with nothing more than a look, he suddenly felt disarmed. Vulnerable. Exposed. Jill's reaction hit him harder than the DNA results themselves. Her tears, her trembling hands, the way she looked at him as if she were seeing a ghost, none of it matched the life he had lived. He had spent years being his own anchor, his own shield, his own enemy. Now, this woman, strong, sharp, infamous for her complexity, was looking at him like he was the missing half of her soul. It shook him. It terrified him. And in some deep, unspoken place, it warmed something in him he didn't even know was frozen. But Matt was not naive. He understood immediately what this meant for Billy. He recognized the storm forming in Billy's eyes, the hurt blooming beneath the surface like a bruise spreading beneath skin. Matt didn't want this war, but he also didn't know how to avoid it. He had not asked for a mother, for belonging, for the tangled mess of emotions that came with family. Yet here it was, shoved into his hands like a responsibility he never wanted but could not refuse. The tension between the two men began not with words, but with silence. Long, suffocating, electrified silence. Billy stared at Matt with a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and something darker, something primal. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't anger. It was loss, raw, bleeding loss that had nowhere to go but outward. Matt, sensing the hostility but also the pain behind it, tried to maintain distance. But distance was no longer possible. Jill, caught in the middle, became frantic in her attempts to reassure both sons, but every attempt only deepened the divide. When she tried to comfort Billy, her voice wavered, her eyes flickering toward Matt as though afraid he might disappear again. And Billy noticed. When she tried to speak to Matt, her voice softened in ways Billy had never heard from her. And Matt noticed. The imbalance of it all became palpable, like the air was warping around them. The first real confrontation happened when Billy finally spoke, his voice low, raw, trembling with emotion he could barely contain. He asked Jill why she never knew. Why she never felt it. Why she never loved him the way she seemed to instinctively love Matt. Jill tried to explain that biology does not dictate love, that she had always loved Billy in her own way, that none of this was his fault. But Billy wasn't asking for excuses. He was asking for answers, and none of Jill's explanations could fill the void he felt opening in his chest. Then Billy turned on Matt, not out of hatred, but out of desperation. He wanted to know what Matt was going to do with this truth, whether he planned to take Jill away from him completely, whether he intended to replace him in every part of her life. Matt, struggling to maintain composure, insisted he never asked for this, never wanted to steal anything from Billy. But his calmness only inflamed Billy's fear. Billy's entire identity was unraveling, and Matt's steady demeanor felt like confirmation that Billy was losing everything while Matt gained everything without even trying. The conflict only escalated from there. Every interaction became a battlefield, every conversation a landmine. Billy, unpredictable and emotionally wounded, lashed out in moments of weakness, blaming Matt for existing, blaming Jill for keeping the truth hidden, blaming fate for its cruelty. Matt, equally overwhelmed but better at disguising it, kept his guard up, refusing to let Billy's attacks break him. But the emotional tension was too thick to ignore. Jill's desperate attempts to bring her sons together only fed the resentment between them. Her instinctive protectiveness toward Matt triggered Billy's deepest insecurities. Her attempts to comfort Billy triggered Matt's deepest fears of being rejected again. They weren't fighting for Jill's love. They were fighting for identity, for belonging, for the right to remain whole in a world that had suddenly redefined them. As the days passed, the rivalry intensified. Billy saw every moment Matt spent with Jill as a threat, a reminder that he had been living someone else's life all along. Matt felt trapped, trying to learn what it meant to have a mother while trying not to destroy the man who had held that role for decades. Jill was torn apart, pulled between guilt, longing, and the impossible burden of trying to be fair to two men whose wounds she didn't know how to heal.